For 5 years, this association has been trespassing on private land.
No resident is above the rules we collectively agreed to maintain.
A red slip of paper fluttered against the weathered white wood of the mailbox taped there before sunrise by someone who had not bothered to knock. Lucas Vance did not curse, nor did he tear it down in a sudden burst of irritation. He simply stood at the end of his gravel drive, read the bold clinical print twice, folded it in half, and slipped it into his jacket pocket. Olivia Thorne, the president of the Homeowners Association, believed this $87 fine was only the beginning of a routine compliance squeeze, a simple administrative pressure designed to force a quiet aging widower into submission. She had no idea that the quiet man in the faded canvas jacket had spent 3 decades tracing corporate fraud for the federal government as a forensic auditor. She had no idea that every red notice she taped to his door from that morning forward was not a victory, but another piece of documentation running directly into a meticulous counter-audit where a trap made of numbers was quietly being laid, waiting for her to step past the line. The farmhouse of Lucas Vance had stood on the ridge since 1954. For half a century, his family's 6 acres remained entirely separate from the world until Whispering Valleys, a gated community of 200 luxury homes, rose right against his eastern boundary. As a retired forensic auditor who had spent 3 decades uncovering corporate fraud for the federal government, Lucas had moved to this ridge solely to find silence after his wife passed away. But that silence lasted exactly 2 weeks. The conflict erupted when the HOA's electric golf cart stopped in front of the farmhouse gate. Olivia Thorne climbed down, clutching her leather clipboard like a scepter, and patronizingly demanded that Lucas repaint his weathered red barn to beige to align with the community aesthetic. When Lucas calmly refused, Olivia's smile instantly hardened. 3 days later, she launched her first strike. A bright red notice demanding an $87 fine was taped directly to his mailbox before sunrise, accusing him of parking his truck 2 inches past his driveway line and leaving his trash can out 10 minutes late. He did not pay the fine, nor did he write back in anger. Instead, he opened a new folder, a simple manila folder. He labeled with the dry precision of his professional background as Whispering Valleys HOA Active Dispute, and placed the notice inside along with a photocopy of his deed and his own handwritten notes of the phone call with Stacy. It was a habit born from decades of corporate forensic auditing. You did not argue with a ledger that didn't add up. You simply documented the discrepancies until the weight of them became impossible to ignore. The notices, however, did not stop. Over the next 2 months, they arrived with the predictable regularity of a subscription, always timed for a Friday afternoon, so that Lucas would have the entire weekend to worry over them before any office opened to answer his questions. One week it was a citation for the angle of his mailbox post. The next a fine for storing a vintage tractor in his equipment shed where it was visible through the window. A third notice claimed his eastern fence line had exceeded the maximum allowed height by 4 inches. Each new complaint carried its own penalty, and each penalty stacked neatly on top of the last, designed to build a debt large enough to feel threatening. Within 90 days, the claim balance had reached $4,800, and the letters had begun to carry the explicit threat of a property lien and eventual foreclosure. Lucas watched the white golf cart slow down near his gate. Most afternoons, Olivia Thorne sitting behind the wheel with her clipboard, her eyes scanning the barn and the driveway with the focused, counting look of a person who believed that everything she looked at would eventually belong to her. The escalation was deliberate, a slow-motion compression designed to squeeze his resolve. Andy began to notice that the association's patrol vehicles, driven by private security guards in matching Navy uniforms that carried no official municipal standing, began slowing down conspicuously in front of his gate at all hours of the day. A guard would linger by the fence line, holding a clipboard and taking photographs of his house and the outbuildings on his phone, while another sat behind the wheel with the engine idling. Lucas would stand on the porch and watch them, his coffee cup held in both hands, his expression entirely neutral, offering them neither the anger they were likely trained to document nor the nervousness that would have suggested he was preparing to yield. They were trying to create a climate of constant surveillance to make his own home feel like a place under review, and he recognized the technique immediately. It was the same administrative pressure he had watched corporate managers apply to employees they wanted to force out, a systematic petty harassment conducted through forms and notices and timed inspections, designed to make the recipient feel that the cost of staying was higher than the cost of surrendering. I did not change his routine. He mowed his pasture on the same schedule, repaired his fences on the same mornings, and sat on his porch in the evenings. His notebook open beside him, recording the license plates and the times of every patrol vehicle that stopped near his gate. It was Ray Holloway who first gave Lucas a window into how far the association's campaign had already reached. Ray was 72, a retired high school history teacher who had lived in Whispering Valleys longer than almost anyone else, and he stopped by the farmhouse on a Tuesday afternoon carrying a plastic accordion folder that had been bound with thick rubber bands to keep it from splitting. They sat at the kitchen table, the coffee going cold between them, while Ray spread the contents out in chronological order. There were 43 written notices, 15 vehicle towing receipts, and 3 formal threats of foreclosure spanning nearly 3 years. The total came to just over $4,000 in cumulative fines paid in installments from a fixed retirement income that left no room for legal fees or prolonged disputes. She picks 1 or 2 of us every year. Ray said it, his voice flat with the resignation of a man who had stopped expecting the system to protect him. Usually someone living alone, someone who doesn't have the family nearby to check in on them. She tells the board it's about community standards, but we all know what it really is. Most people pay because they're afraid of the lawyers. They pay because they don't know they have any other choice. Lucas read through Ray's folder, noting the specific section numbers cited in each notice numbers that when checked against the community handbook did not correspond to any rule the association had ever formally adopted. The fines had been assessed under provisions that did not exist, using language that had been invented to sound official enough to discourage close reading. The pattern was identical to the one Lucas had seen in dozens of corporate fraud investigations: the systematic extraction of small defensible amounts from people who lacked the resources or the confidence to challenge the paperwork. If a resident complained, the board's attorney, a sharp young man named Gregory Pierce, who was paid by the hour from the General Operating Fund, would send a formal multi-page response filled with dense legal citations designed to make the dispute look too expensive to pursue. If the resident persisted, the fines would double, a lien would be threatened, and eventually the homeowner would write a check simply to reclaim the peace of mind they had moved to the ridge to find. Lucas took careful, high-resolution photographs of Ray's documents, added the details to a spreadsheet on his laptop, and spent the next 3 days walking the ridge road, having quiet, careful conversations with other neighbors. He found Lillian Marsh, a widow who had paid nearly $1,200 in fines for a garden gnome she had inherited from her late husband, and a young couple who had paid $1,500 after their car was towed from their own driveway on the morning the wife went into labor. Every story arrived with the same particular quality: a quiet, heavy damage that the dry language of an HOA notice could never fully convey. He began to see that Olivia Thorne's authority did not rest on the law. It rested on the shared silent assumption of her neighbors that she would make their lives too expensive if they refused to agree with her. Lucas did not share his spreadsheet with anyone, nor did he mention his background as a forensic auditor to the neighbors who stopped by his porch to offer advice. He simply listened, took notes, and let the folder in his study grow heavier. I understood with the clarity of someone who had spent his life studying institutional greed that the only way to stop a system built on intimidation was to force the people running it to defend their paperwork in a room they did not control. His first step was to establish the physical reality of the boundary. He called Tom Willis, a licensed professional land surveyor who had mapped property lines in the county for nearly 30 years, and asked him to conduct a comprehensive independent boundary survey of the 6 acres. Tom arrived on a bright Thursday morning with a truck loaded with high-precision GPS equipment, a total station, and a set of original county cadastral maps from the 1970s. I was a methodical man, unhurried and precise, and he spent 2 full days walking the boundary, driving steel stakes with bright orange caps into the earth at measured intervals. Olivia Thorne drove past twice on her golf cart during those 2 days, slowing to a crawl near the fence line. Her clipboard raised as if she were taking notes on the survey crew, but she did not climb out to speak to them. She had apparently decided that the survey was a sign of desperation, an old man's attempt to find a few inches of ground to argue over, and she saw no reason to interrupt a process she believed would ultimately confirm her own authority. Tom did not look up from his total station, did not offer her a wave, and did not pause his work until the last marker was driven. When he finally walked up to the porch steps on the second evening, his boots caked in wet clay, he set his field notebook on the table and looked at Lucas with an expression that mixed professional caution with quiet amusement. "You don't just have a clean deed, Lucas," Tom said, pointing to a diagram he had sketched on his tablet. "You have an encroachment, and it's not a small one." He walked Lucas through the coordinates: the association's freshly paved community walking trail, an expensive concrete pathway that ran along the ridge, and had been featured in their marketing materials as a premier amenity crossed onto the Vance property line by nearly 8 feet along a 300-foot stretch of the boundary. Two custom decorative streetlights installed by the HOA the previous spring at a cost of several $1,000s each stood firmly planted in soil that belonged legally to Lucas Vance. The encroachment had been there for nearly 5 years, inherited from the previous developer, who had simply laid the path along what looked like a convenient line without ever pulling the deed survey to verify where the private pasture actually began. Every resident who walked that path, every security vehicle that patrolled the edge of the ridge, and even the lights that burned along the fence line at night were currently trespassing on private land. The path had been laid with thick steel-reinforced concrete, and the light poles were anchored in deep concrete footings that had required heavy equipment to excavate, making their removal a complicated and expensive engineering problem. Tom compiled the findings into a formal sealed boundary report, stamped it with his professional seal, and filed it with the county recorder's office. The following morning, making the encroachment a matter of official public record, Lucas forwarded a copy of the survey report to the association's legal counsel within 48 hours, along with a formal notice of trespass and a demand that the concrete pathway and the streetlights be removed from his land within 30 days at the association's expense. The response from the law firm was curt and dismissive, written by an associate who had clearly not taken the time to read the deed reference numbers. The letter insisted that the association's boundary line was established by historical usage, and that any attempt to restrict resident access to the community trail would result in immediate legal action. Lucas did not respond to the letter. He simply placed it in the folder marked Active Litigation Preparation and initiated his second line of inquiry, a formal demand filed under his rights as a property owner adjacent to an active development zone to inspect the association's financial ledgers and annual audit reports for the past 3 years. Under state law, any homeowners association operating within a planned development district was required to make its financial records open for inspection by any resident who filed a written request. If the association refused, the state regulatory department could suspend its enforcement authority pending a full audit, a provision that Lucas had memorized from the state property code during his first week of research. Olivia Thorne had spent years assuming nobody would ever bother to ask for the receipts, and she was about to discover that the quiet man in the farmhouse was a forensic auditor who had spent his career finding the lies hidden between the columns of a ledger. The financial documents were delivered to Lucas's kitchen table 2 weeks later, contained in a thin cardboard box that had been sealed with plastic tape as if to discourage the person opening it. They were incomplete, disorganized, and clearly assembled in a hurry by someone who believed that disorganization was a sufficient form of concealment. There were invoices for maintenance work that carried no itemized breakdown repair bills, paid in full to companies registered at private residential addresses, and a recurring monthly fee of $3,400 charged to the reserve fund for compliance consulting services. Lucas sat under his reading lamp with a yellow highlighter and a calculator, the house silent around him, except for the occasional ticking of the old clock on the mantel, and began working through the pages line by line. Within 3 hours, the columns of numbers began to tell their own story, the particular clumsy story of a small-town embezzlement scheme that had been allowed to run unchecked simply because nobody had ever demanded an audit. The compliance consulting fees had been paid to an entity called Thorne Solutions, a company registered in Delaware, whose principal officer was listed in corporate filings as Olivia's brother. I had been receiving payments from the HOA's reserve account for 4 years, totaling nearly $160,000, without ever submitting a single progress report or a written consulting brief. Over those 4 years, more than $160,000 had been quietly transferred from the community's infrastructure reserve fund into that account, approved by a board that consisted entirely of Olivia's hand-picked allies. There was more. Lucas traced the invoices for the concrete pathway and the streetlights that had been installed on his land. The contract had been awarded to a local construction firm owned by the husband of another board member at a rate that sat nearly 40% above the average market cost for municipal paving work. The special assessments levied against residents for emergency stormwater repairs had been collected and deposited into the operating account, then immediately withdrawn to pay for administrative expenses that carried no supporting receipts. It was a textbook extraction machine operating under the guise of community governance, and every single transaction had been signed and approved by Olivia Thorne herself in her capacity as association president. She had been siphoning the reserve cash into her family's accounts while using the fines collected from residents to cover the deficits in the operating fund. Lucas spent the weekend compiling the findings into a 50-page audit report, cross-referencing each transaction with the bank, records the corporate filings and the county recorder's deed documents, and backed up the files to 3 separate cloud drives. He had the names, the dates, the bank transfers, and the signatures. He had the entire structure of her authority, and it was written in her own handwriting, on her own official stationery, a paper trail of systematic fraud that any prosecutor could read without an explanation. The email arrived at 11:47 on a Thursday night, sent from Olivia's personal account while the rest of the ridge was dark. It was the first time she had written to him directly, bypassing her lawyers, and the language was tight with the desperate, ugly energy of someone who had realized the ground was beginning to shift beneath her feet. She accused him of conducting an illegal harassment campaign against the board, warned him that continued interference with association business would result in immediate foreclosure proceedings against his property, and suggested in a paragraph that stopped just short of an explicit threat that an old farmhouse like his was a significant fire hazard in a dry valley. Lucas read the message once on his phone, the screen casting a pale light across the dark kitchen. He did not feel angry, nor did he feel the sudden spike of adrenaline that would have kept most men awake until dawn. He felt instead the quiet, profound relief of a surveyor who had finally found the corner pin he had been searching for in the weeds. He saved the email in 3 separate formats, forwarded a copy to his attorney, and went to bed. She had put her intentions on paper, and in the forensic world, Lucas inhabited a threat written on paper was not a demonstration of power. It was a signature on a confession. The message was the final piece of the pattern, the moment when the administrator of a systematic fraud finally loses her composure and reveals the personal malice behind the official notices, leaving no room for her attorneys to claim that she had acted in good faith or out of administrative error. The general town hall meeting was held on the first Thursday of November in the community center at the end of Sycamore Lane. The room was standing room only, every folding chair filled, and dozens of residents standing along the back wall, drawn by the whispers that had been circulating through the neighborhood for weeks. Olivia Thorne sat at the long folding table at the front of the room, flanked by her 4 board members, her posture rigid and her chin lifted in her usual expression of practiced elegance. She opened the meeting with a presentation on the Heritage Preservation Initiative, speaking about home values and standards and the importance of compliance, her voice carrying the smooth corporate cadence of someone who had spent her life managing rooms of people who didn't know how to look at a balance sheet. When she finished her remarks, she clicked her laser pointer to a slide showing the Vance farmhouse and announced that the board had voted unanimously to initiate foreclosure proceedings against the property to satisfy the outstanding fines. "We must protect the integrity of our standards," she told the room, her voice echoing slightly through the PA system. "No resident is above the rules we collectively agreed to maintain." The room was completely silent, the kind of heavy, waiting quiet that descends before a storm, while the board's attorney shuffled his papers, preparing to read the formal legal resolution that would put Lucas's house up for auction. Lucas stood up from the 3rd row. He did not carry a clipboard, did not raise his voice, and did not offer any preamble about his family's history in the valley. He walked to the front of the room carrying a small laptop and a gray USB drive and connected it to the projector before the board's attorney could stand to object. The first image that appeared on the white wall behind the board was the 1954 deed, the legal description highlighted in yellow, followed immediately by Tom Willis's certified survey map showing the concrete path and the streetlights sitting 8 feet inside his property line. "For 5 years," Lucas said, his voice level and unhurried, "this association has been trespassing on private land. The path your residents walk every morning, the lights you paid $22,000 to install sit on my pasture. And your legal counsel has ignored 2 certified letters informing them of this fact." A low murmur ran through the room, the sudden fabric rustle of 80 people shifting in their chairs at once. Olivia did not move her hands, remaining folded flat on her clock binder, but her eyes locked onto Lucas with an expression that had gone completely cold. She did not know what was on the next slide, but the stillness of the man standing at the podium told her that whatever it was, her attorneys would not be able to write her way out of it. He did not give her time to recover. He clicked to the next slide, the banking records for the reserve fund, the highlighted transfers to Thorn Solutions, the corporate filings showing her brother's name as the sole principal of the consulting firm, and the invoices for the pathway paving signed by her brother-in-law's construction company. Line by line, transfer by transfer, he walked the room through the 50-page audit report he had compiled, his voice steady and clinical, presenting the findings with the detached precision of an expert witness, explaining a complex fraud scheme to a jury. He read the late-night email she had sent him, the text projected on the wall in letters 3 feet tall, the paragraph about the fire hazard, landing on the silent room with the heavy physical weight of a door closing. By the time he finished, the two board members sitting to Olivia's left were looking down at the table in front of them, their pens clicking nervously, unable to meet the eyes of the neighbors who were now standing in the aisles demanding answers. Several residents, people who had spent years paying fines they couldn't afford out of fear of having their homes taken, were openly weeping or shouting questions at the table, their voices rising all at once in a general unchecked anger that she had spent 6 years trying to keep down. The board's attorney stood up, his folder of notes clutched to his chest, and quietly advised Olivia that the meeting should be adjourned immediately. It was too late. The room had already stopped listening to her, and the silence that settled over the clubhouse was the genuine article. The sheriff's department opened a formal inquiry the following morning, initiated by a filing Daniel Ross had submitted to the county prosecutor's office, along with the certified survey, the audit report, and the recorded late-night email. Olivia Thorne resigned from the presidency 3 weeks later, her brief letter to the board citing personal health considerations and conspicuously omitting any mention of the investigation. The Thorne Solutions accounts, or the concrete pathway that the association's contractors were currently excavating from Lucas's pasture at their own expense. The remaining board members voted unanimously to dissolve the enforcement committee, suspend all outstanding compliance fines, pending independent review, and issue a formal written apology to Lucas Vance for the administrative discrepancies that had occurred during her tenure. The new board, elected at an emergency community meeting in January and headed by a retired civil engineer who had lived on the ridge for 9 years, began its first session by adopting a new set of bylaws that mandated quarterly financial audits, public disclosure of all vendor contracts, and a formal recorded appeals process for any future compliance dispute. The old red farmhouse sat quiet in the early winter light, the smoke from the wood stove rising straight into a sky that had turned the color of slate. Lucas Vance walked the eastern boundary fence line on a Saturday morning, the fresh dirt where the concrete path had been removed now graded and covered in straw to protect the soil from the winter freeze. The stakes with the bright orange caps were still there, left in place by Tom Willis as a courtesy to the landowner, marking the precise line where his pasture ended and the rest of the world began. He ran a hand along the weathered wood of the old gatepost, the cedar solid and cold under his fingers, and felt the specific steady peace of a man who had simply wanted his front door to belong to him and had been patient enough to make sure it did. A property he had come to understand through the long months of the audit was not simply a piece of land described on a deed or a name recorded in a county register. It was a promise kept alive across generations, a boundary that truth quietly protected long after everyone else had stopped bothering to look for it. He walked back toward the porch, the air smelling of pine and wood smoke, and put the kettle on for coffee. He looked out over the pasture toward the houses of Whispering Valleys, their copper roofs glowing in the thin January sun, and he felt neither triumph nor lingering anger. The account was settled, the boundary was restored, and the valley was silent again, and this time the silence was his own. To make sure that the narrative has the slow-building atmospheric quality of the original sources. Lucas remembered how his father had reset those fence posts decades earlier. The work had been physical, demanding a kind of quiet exactness that didn't allow for shortcuts. His father used to say that a boundary only meant something if you were willing to walk it yourself, to clear the brush that grew over it, and to replace the rotted wood before the winter storms could tear it down. I had lived by that rule, and standing on the porch now, watching the shadow of the ridge stretch long and blue across the meadows, Lucas understood that the paperwork he had spent his life studying was simply another form of that same maintenance. A boundary is not protected by noise. It is protected by the unhurried, documented certainty of the people who belong to it. The red slip of paper that had started it all sat folded in the drawer of his father's desk, its cheap print fading slightly, its $87 demand reduced to nothing more than a curious footnote in the county's public files. The path was gone, the custom streetlights were gone, and the people who had believed their authority extended past the edge of the ridge had been forced to learn exactly where the line had always been drawn. The silence was deep, cold, and entirely undivided. There was a particular kind of peace that came from that realization, a quietness that settled into his chest, the way the evening fog settled into the hollows of the creek below his pasture. He remembered walking the property lines with his father when he was still young enough to think that the ridge was the edge of the entire world, and his father had stopped near the western corner to point out an old stone marker that had been carved with the initials of the original homesteader. "The land doesn't belong to the loudest voice, Lucas," his father had told him, his voice low and unhurried as he cleared a handful of pine needles from the surface of the stone. "It belongs to the person who has the patience to keep the records, to pay the taxes, and to walk the lines when the weather is bad. The people who come here later, the ones who want to build their houses in rows, they'll try to tell you that boundaries are just suggestions, that they can be moved if enough people agree to move them. But a deed is a promise, and a promise doesn't change just because the neighbors have decided they want a better view." He had not understood the full weight of those words when he was a boy, but standing on the porch, now watching the first snow of the season begin to fall in thin, lazy flakes across the ridge, he understood them completely. The Homeowners Association had believed they could rewrite the history of the ridge through sheer repetition, that sending enough notices and levying enough fines would eventually make their authority real. But they had built their entire community on top of a lie, and the lie had collapsed the moment someone took the time to check the paperwork. The regional newspaper ran a follow-up feature on the Whispering Valleys HOA 3 weeks after the town hall meeting, written by a veteran reporter named Harriet Morton, who had spent 20 years covering property disputes and municipal governance across the state. She had spent 2 days in the county records room reviewing the files Lucas had provided, interviewing Ray and Lillian, and consulting with a land use professor at the state university who described the association's boundary claims as a textbook case of administrative overreach. The article was detailed, unadorned, and devastating, laying out the timeline of the fines, the altered boundary maps, and the financial transfers to Thorn Solutions in a clean chronological table that left no room for editorialization or excuse. Several of the board members who had voted to authorize the foreclosure proceedings against Lucas were interviewed, and each one offered a variation of the same apologetic explanation. They had trusted the president had signed the documents without reading them closely, and had assumed that an organization with legal counsel and official letterhead must surely have the authority it claimed. It was the same excuse Lucas had heard from corporate board members in dozens of fraud investigations: the slow, comfortable surrender of responsibility that always precedes a collapse. They had not been cruel, not in any active or deliberate way, but they had allowed themselves to be used as a shield by someone who was, and the consequences of that passivity were now written in public print for everyone in the county to read. Lillian Marsh came by the farmhouse on a Saturday afternoon in February, carrying a plate of warm cornbread and a small weathered wooden box that had belonged to her late husband. She sat on the porch with Lucas for an hour, watching the birds work the feeders he had hung along the eaves, and talked about the garden she was planning to replant in the spring. Under the new board's guidelines, residents were once again permitted to cultivate their own yards, and she had spent the week clearing the weeds from the old raised beds behind her house, preparing the soil for the tomatoes and herbs she had not been allowed to grow for 3 years. "I was ready to sell," she admitted, her voice quiet, as she looked out over the pasture. "When the notices kept coming and the fines started doubling every month, I used to sit in my kitchen at night and feel so small, like I was living in a place that didn't want me here unless I could afford to pay them to leave me alone. I didn't have the money for a lawyer, Lucas, and I didn't know how to read the bylaws to find the lies she was telling us. If you hadn't stood up at that meeting, if you hadn't shown us those papers, I'd have been gone by the end of the winter." Lucas had nodded, thanked her for the cornbread, and told her simply that he was glad she was staying. He had not fought the association to become a hero to his neighbors, but as he watched her walk back down the gravel road toward her house, her posture lighter than it had been in years, he understood that the boundary he had defended was not just his own pasture. It was the quiet, ordinary lives of the people who lived beside it. The new fence was completed in the spring, built along the corrected boundary line with the help of Ray Holloway and 2 other neighbors who had volunteered to spend a Saturday driving the posts. It was a sturdy split-rail fence made from weathered cedar that looked as though it had been there for decades. Its lines perfectly straight, its gates set with heavy iron hardware that opened and closed without a sound. Lucas had reset the original mailbox post himself, leveling it with a plumb bob and packing the base with gravel to ensure it would stand through the spring rains, and he had repainted his grandfather's red barn in the same deep, rich crimson it had carried since 1961. The concrete pathway was gone, the custom streetlights were gone, and the ridge was quiet again in the way it had been when his father first built the farmhouse. He sat on the porch in the late afternoon, his coffee cup warm in his hands, watching a pair of red-tailed hawks ride the thermals above the pasture and let the silence of the valley settle around him. The homeowners association had believed that control was the same thing as ownership, that they could dictate what a man did with his own land simply because they had the power to make his life expensive if he refused to comply. But they had forgotten that there is a different kind of authority, one that does not require clipboards or newsletters or Navy uniforms to make itself understood. The quiet, unshakable weight of the truth, recorded in county ink, signed by honest men, and patiently defended by those who know exactly where the line is drawn. It was his farm. It had always been his farm. And as the last of the light faded behind the western peaks, the ridge was quiet, and the quiet was entirely his own. The winter settled fully over the ridge, the frost silvering the split-rail fence and the bare branches of the oak trees along the eastern boundary. Lucas Vance spent his afternoons in the workshop. The smell of seasoned wood and wood oil thick in the warm air as he worked on restoring an old oak table he had salvaged from his grandfather's cabin. He worked slowly with the quiet, methodical patience of a man who had spent his life looking at the fine details, checking the grain, leveling the legs, and ensuring that every joint was true before he glued it. The work was physical, simple, and honest, a clean contrast to the years of tracing lies through corporate ledgers and financial disclosures, and he found in the repetition of it a kind of peace that he had nearly forgotten how to hold. The new board had sent out its first quarterly newsletter in January, a single sheet of plain paper that listed the dates of the upcoming community meetings, a proposed schedule for road maintenance, and a reminder that the approved paint color list was available for review at the library. There were no compliance warnings, no itemized lists of aesthetic violations, and no threatening letters from attorneys paid by the hour. The neighborhood was slowly learning what it felt like to live without fear, and the change was visible in the small, ordinary details of daily life. A child's bicycle left in a driveway, a garden gnome sitting on a porch, a different shade of blue painted on a front door. Lucas had not asked for any of it, had not sought to reform the community or teach anyone a lesson about the limits of their authority. But he had stood his ground on what was right, and the land itself had taken care of the rest. He reeled in his lines, closed his notebook, and went back inside his kitchen, warm with the smell of coffee and wood smoke. And as the night came on and the first stars appeared over the mountains, the valley was silent and the silence was his own.